2 days after the promise of a $2 million reward, police have swooped on bushland in Newcastle as they reopen a cold case into the disappearance of 2 teenage girls. Detectives have spent the day at an old scout camp, digging by hand and by bulldozer in a search for human remains.
Today's operation at the former scout camp comes 2 days after a $2 million reward was announced.
What we've seen in the last couple of days is proof that the New South Wales Police don't believe that a cold case should ever go cold.
Detectives have received dozens of tip-offs.
It stimulated a lot of interest. We are reviewing every single bit of information that comes through.
The site is 20 kilometres from where Robyn disappeared and just 9 kilometres from where Amanda was last seen.
Do you think she's alive now?
No.
It's 1979. Amanda Therese Robinson is getting ready for her first ever night out. It's the school dance. And with her blue jeans and yellow shirt, she's ready to go. It wasn't easy convincing her family to let her go to this dance. Amanda's mother, Anne, is currently in hospital after a postnatal complication. So she figures she needs to come up with a plan and organises a friend's father to drive her home, which in turn convinces Anne. Fast forward a few hours and the music plays, laughter and dancing dominate the night, and before anyone knows it, it's 10:30 p.m. Amanda's friend's dad arrives to pick up the girls, but Amanda isn't ready to go home yet. This is her first night out and her first real taste of independence. And she isn't too worried. She figures she can just catch a bus home. So she walks with her classmates to the local bus stop and heads directly across the road towards a phone box to call her stepfather, Eddie. She tells him she'll be out late and asks him to meet her at their local bus stop. The clock ticks past midnight and finally the 348 bus from Newcastle pulls up and Amanda's friends shout, "The bus is coming!" And Amanda ends her call with Eddie and jumps aboard and settles in for the ride. And 20 minutes later, steps off in her neighbourhood where the streets are quiet and dim and Eddie isn't at the bus stop. He fell asleep. So Amanda starts the walk home, only a few hundred metres away. But by morning, Amanda's bed remains empty. And Anne is released from hospital into immediate desperation and chaos as her family scrambles, checking every possible place she might be. Amanda's brothers scour the streets in the local bush, while the police suggest she's probably just run away. But those who know Amanda know better. As it goes, Amanda's family weren't the only family out there looking for a daughter. Just 13 days earlier, another young woman, Robyn Hickie, had vanished in near identical circumstances.
In our situation, you always hope, but experience teaches you that after a certain amount of time and a certain number of disappointments, there's no such thing as closure in this work.
That was Jim Hickie, the father of Robyn Hickie, expressing what I think is the most pertinent and certainly the most prolific of themes and motifs within this entire series. That closure and resolution and understanding is never guaranteed, and unlike a movie, tension may never be released. In part one, we focused on the poignant parliamentary address by the Honourable Jeremy Buckingham, where he addressed his fellow parliamentarians directly, expressing grave concern over the unresolved homicides and disappearances of 67 women and men across the North Coast area of New South Wales between 1977 and 2015, particularly pointing out the egregious police handling. We heard about the disappearances of Marty Ellen Fox and Annika Adrianson, a young couple committed to buying a plot of land in Baringba who seemingly vanished into thin air on their way home, last spotted at a bus stop in Byron Bay in 1978, quickly followed by the disappearances of two young women by the names of Annie Tomanak and Joy Hodgins, the first two of 6 disappearances which would occur in quick succession and rock the Hunter Newcastle region between 1978 and 1979. Part 2 focuses on the remaining 4 women who make up the Newcastle 6. Amanda Robinson, whose story we've just heard, just 14, when she was abducted and disappeared, likely hundreds of meters away from her family home. Robyn Hickie, whose father we've just heard from, 18 years old when she went missing. Leanne Goodall, 20. And Amanda Zolis, just 16, when she disappeared into the night also. And it's within these 6 disappearances and this time frame of 1978 to 1979 in the Hunter Newcastle region where I think we see our first glimpses and indications of an active serial killer operating in the North Coast area of New South Wales. I haven't really addressed or spoken about the who. I haven't really spoken about suspects besides Ivan Milat, whose name can't really be wiped off in any conversation that involves young women or a hitchhiker disappearing around that region at the time. So let's pick back up with the disappearances of Robyn Hickie and Amanda Robinson. 2 teenagers, 2 bus stops, both disappeared into the night, both on the Pacific Highway, with these 2 disappearances happening only 13 days apart under identical circumstances. It beggars belief that the police struggled at first to connect these 2 disappearances as possibly linked, but they did. Future investigators and even coroners would all later condemn these early missteps, saying that the more that they dug into the issue, the more it became apparent that so much was missing or had simply been lost. The investigations, as we're already becoming quickly accustomed to, were shockingly casual. They label Robyn Hickie, an 18-year-old girl, as a known hitchhiker. And with Amanda Robinson, they follow a line of questioning that leads them to suspect that she is just hiding out with her boyfriend, having run away from home after the dance, while crucial information is slipping by. Because on the night of Amanda's disappearance, 2 women, separate women, would call the police, drawing their attention to a scream. A scream independently heard in the night, to which police did arrive and peruse the factory in which the 2 women had pointed the police, but crucially did not take any statements on the night. So what may have been critical information was dead on arrival. Police also failed to speak to the 2 uniformed police officers that were patrolling that area of Swansea that night. 2 people predisposed and trained to recognise bizarre and suspicious human behaviour as well as suspicious vehicles. Incredibly, it gets worse because on a police run sheet of that night, documentation they do have is another incident happening. And that was the attempted abduction of a totally different woman. And according to this run sheet, the woman was walking down the street before a car pulled up. The assailant tried to abduct her, dragging her into the car. However, she began kicking and screaming and managed to get away. Now, this attempted abduction that took place on the same night in which a successful abduction would also take place somehow didn't warrant any investigation, and I say that because it went uninvestigated. With so little followed up on, so little documented, so little officialized, it does beg the question, whose were those screams? As for Robyn Hickie's parents, Jim and Mary, what eventuated was equally as dire, tried to assist the authorities at every turn, early on providing some of Robyn's personal effects, including photos and even a dental mold, in the hope that if a body ever was If it ever did surface, then identification might be possible. But years passed and nothing, so eventually Jim asks for this property back. Of course, the police had indeed lost the dental mould, and the photos so deeply personal to the Hickie family, compounding this family's stress over the years and their eroding faith in a system that was meant to help them. Thankfully, in 2019, a more rigorous cold case investigation effort emerged when police launched Strike Force Arapaima, a team of 4 Lake Macquarie investigators brought together to try and right the wrongs of the past. A team that was formed to investigate specifically the disappearances of Robyn, Amanda, and Gordana Kotevski, a 16-year-old woman who would disappear under identical circumstances, albeit 15 years later in 1994. The question still, of course, needs to be asked, is 40 years too late? It's early autumn 1980. Standing at the Newcastle West Markets is the 18-year-old Linda Ray. She's got her thumb out, just trying to catch a ride home. The car slows and stops beside her, and Linda opens the passenger door and slides in. The car doesn't head toward Merriweather where Linda is trying to get to, instead winds its way towards Glen Rock Scout Camp along a lonely road. Scout Camp Road. The driver's hand shoots out like a snake, locking around her wrist with crushing force. The man spits, "You've gotten with the wrong one now, baby." The driver suddenly pulls over, violently dragging Linda into the back seat and starts ripping at her clothes. But through the trees, headlights appear. Instantly, Linda makes her moves and breaks free, running completely naked towards those approaching lights like they're her last chance. The occupants, a young couple, open the car door and let her in. And to this day, Linda credits that couple with saving her life. Linda goes to the police, makes a statement, and less than 4 weeks later, a man is arrested and charged, an 18-year-old man who was brought before the courts in Newcastle, but ultimately acquitted. Now rewind 15 months before Linda's attack. A tiny 10-year-old girl is riding her little bike around Blacksmith Beach on her summer holidays. The green Holden Tirana seemed to materialize out of thin air, cutting across her path so suddenly that her bike slammed into the driver's door. And that's when she saw him, the man that would haunt her for decades to come. Skinny, long hair, but it was his eyes that made her blood run cold. They were completely black. There was no attempt at deception, no lure, no fake promises of candy, just 5 words. Get in the fucking car. But this little girl wasn't just any 10-year-old girl. She was a state runner for her age group, skills that would become her salvation, because in the distance she spotted a man mowing his lawn, a man who by some miracle turned out to be a police officer. And she ran, and she ran, and she ran for her life.
In 1979, Robyn Hickie, 18, and 14-year-old Amanda Robinson disappeared within a fortnight of each other near bus stops in the Swansea and Belmont areas. A full-time strike force has been operating for 4 months, and now it is examining the possibility of a serial killer. An emerald green Tirana, the sort of car someone might remember 40 years later.
Someone who has knowledge of that vehicle, or a vehicle fitting that description, that may not have come forward back then.
Police have interviewed hundreds of witnesses from then and now. The green Tirana, say police, is not the strongest evidence they've uncovered, but it is clearly important to them.
Our 10-year-old state runner is now 50, living a normal life when she sees the images appear on her television. In an instant, she recognizes the green car, transported back to a place and a time that she never wanted to go again. She immediately contacts the strike force, repeating every detail the same way she did on day one. The driver, the car, those black eyes. But the real shock comes 2 years later, in 2021, As she scrolls through Facebook one day, she comes across an NBN news post. And there he is, staring at her from across the screen. The face she's never forgotten. The man with the black eyes, the one that tried to take her. The monster from her childhood finally has a name. Warren John McCorriston. Warren John McCorriston was charged with this attack. However, the case was ultimately dropped. Despite this woman having told the same story again and again, decade after decade after decade, never changing tact, and the instant recognition that day when she recognized the car and the person in the car, despite all of that, the legal system decided that the Facebook photo had somehow obfuscated or muddied the waters of identification. But while in this case McCorriston's charges were dropped, and in Linda Ray's case where the case was acquitted, Warren John McCorriston's penchant and history of sexual violence and his perversions and lust for domination and control over women was so great that those 5 charges that were dropped were only 5 of the 28 in total that he would be facing. But let's rewind the clock back a bit. Just who is Warren John McCorriston? Warren McCorriston grew up in Belmont, a suburb of Lake Macquarie. In the 70s, as a teenager, he attended Belmont High School, where he was a year below a certain young woman by the name of Robyn Hickie. By the time he was 18, McCorriston had already attracted the eye of law enforcement through the case we've just heard about, Linda Ray's, where he was ultimately acquitted. But in the years that followed, Warren John McCorriston seemingly got it all together, and he began a journey of self-discovery, building himself a career in the hospitality and property management sectors, slithering his way up, all the way up to the C-suite. Like many a psychopath, general manager for the Daydream Island Resort in Whitsundays, as well as everybody's favorite role, the body corporate manager at one of the most iconic skyrises in Surfers Paradise. McCorriston's colleagues consistently described his personality as narcissistic and aloof, pointing out his meticulous attention for detail. And in December 2019, as tourists flocked to Surfers Paradise for their summer holidays, McCorriston's life began to unravel. Strike Force Arapaima had identified him as a person of interest in the Hickie and Robinson cases and began gathering evidence. And by January 8, 2020, the net had closed in.
Arrested in January on the Gold Coast, Warren McCorriston is facing charges in relation to alleged offences against 3 women between 1979 and 1999, including sexual assault and attempting to choke or strangle. Today, the former Belmont man's case was briefly mentioned in Newcastle local court, and detectives came armed with a new charge, abducting a girl under 16 years from a lawful parent. Police allege it occurred in 1979 when the girl was just 10 years old.
McCorriston was charged with 28 offences, pleading guilty to 5 of those offences and another 5 of those offences being taken into consideration by the judge while sentencing. Ultimately, 17 of the 28 charges brought before the court were dropped. McCorriston, appearing via video link, offered a tearful apology. To all the young ladies involved, I offer my most humble apology. I am remorseful. More so for the fact that I have impacted on them. They did not deserve to be treated in that manner. And I hope this goes some way that will allow them to move on. Crown Prosecutor Hamish Fitzharding was a little more sceptical of McCorriston's remorse, stating, I doubt there is any hope of rehabilitation. McCorriston was sentenced to 8.5 years in prison with a minimum non-parole period of 4.5 years, but given the time he had already served, he was eligible for parole in July last year. And while McCorriston's assaults are terrifying, they are only a small part in a larger story. because during Strike Force Arapaima's reinvestigations, police were able to uncover a web of depravity that extended far beyond McCorriston, a suspected pedophile ring linked to the second Belmont Sea Scouts, and at the very centre was George Cecil, the scoutmaster and bus driver. Back in 2010, different detectives on different business had already searched Cecil's home and found a trove of disturbing evidence. Child abuse and child sexual abuse images and neatly organised newspaper clippings about the disappearances of Robyn Hickie and Amanda Robinson. Cecil, who died in 2015, was never charged in relation to the missing girls, but his connection to Warren McCorriston and other sexual predators in the area does raise serious questions. Roger Steele, a former Sea Scouts member, came forward with allegations that Cecil had abused him during a scouting trip in the 1970s, with McCorriston also on that trip. Steele recalled, "George Cecil took photographs of us naked and groomed us by telling us tales of his sexual exploits. He would encourage us to talk about our fantasies, and he abused me on that trip along the Great North Walk." But despite these allegations, Warren McCorriston refused to corroborate Steele's account when questioned by police in 2010. The suspected presence of multiple predators within the small orbit of the Sea Scouts starts to make the community question, how does an institution so fundamentally aligned with moral guidance become so morally deficient and led by those so morally bankrupt? These questions only intensified when police officers formally announced Warren McCorriston as a person of interest into the disappearances of the teenage girls, with investigators honing in on staff rosters, trying to find documentation as well as the recollections of the aging members who proudly once wore their scout badges. And it was within this search that police would make a finding that would exacerbate local whisperings about the potentiality that George Cecil and Warren McCorriston were far more involved and even pivotal figures in the disappearances of these teenage girls. Strike Force Arapaima detectives were somewhat incredibly able to source a visitor's book or visitor's log from the Swansea Bowling Club on the night Amanda Robinson disappeared. And it was at the Swansea Bowling Club on this night where the Sea Scouts were holding a fundraiser. McCorriston, Cecil, and two other men, both later charged with unrelated child abuse offences, were in attendance. And it's striking, isn't it, the similarities. The young female victims, either alone or hitchhiking specifically, approached in a car, taken to an isolated spot, and the synergy of bus stops and bus drivers, of missing girls in scout camps and scout gatherings. And in 2019, as we know, detectives released images of the green Tirana. Which person from the fundraising dinner owned a green Tirana at the time? I'm sure at this point it doesn't take a lot to deduce who. Strike Force Arapaima has not charged Warren John McCorriston with anything to do with the missing girls. He remains alleged, he remains a suspect, a person of interest, he remains rumour.
There are also striking similarities to two other cases. Reports show Leanne had also planned to catch a bus that day to her mother's home at Belmont, which was just a few hundred metres from where Robyn Hickie went missing from a bus stop just 3 months later, while Amanda Robinson vanished shortly after that, catching a bus home to Swansea.
It's only a few months apart, really, so you'd think that it was the same person being so close together.
$1 million rewards have been announced for other high-profile hunter cases. Leanne's has long been $100,000.
It's always a hole in your heart, it's like she's the forgotten child.
It's December 30th, 1978, and a beautiful summer's day in Lake Macquarie. 20-year-old Leanne Beth Goodall is abuzz with the familiar excitement that the new year brings. Leanne is in many ways the quintessential Australian girl who loves the sun, the water, and the simple comforts of life, her friends and family who adore her right back, and her sister Pam, who shares her sense of humour. Leanne is always the girl with a plan who often talks about the new places that she wants to see and the new things that she wants to do. She might hop on a train to visit friends or head into Newcastle for the night, but she loves getting out and about and meeting new people, hearing their stories and letting the world surprise her. Everyone who knows Leanne describes her as friendly and generous, and the kind of girl who gives out compliments and means every word. So Leanne boards a train in Muswell Brook and heads towards Newcastle, sits down, gazes out the window as the countryside unfolds mile by mile in a sunlit blur, and she chats with the fellow passengers, flashing that easy smile of hers as the train rattles along, carrying her closer and closer to her destination, the Star Hotel. And when Leanne arrives, the late afternoon sun still hangs in the sky, and she steps onto the station platform, moving through the crowds of weekend travellers. In the midst of holiday season, there is an air of excitement all around as families gather for celebrations and friends unite for New Year's parties. And the promise of good times pulses through every corner of the city. When Leanne arrives to the Star Hotel, people instantly recognise her, some by name and some just by her friendly, familiar face. She picks up little bits of conversation and orders a drink, exchanging warm welcomes and greetings with a few acquaintances that happen to be at the Star, and the music is lively, the chatter is constant. And it feels like a place she could stay all night. But she doesn't. At some point she says goodbye and heads off, possibly to continue her evening elsewhere, or maybe to find a ride back to Lake Macquarie. The hours pass, the city grows quiet, the streets empty, the sun rises, and Leanne is simply gone. Leanne Goodall's disappearance was rather crucially marred by a serious misunderstanding when Beth Goodall, Leanne's mother, had initially thought that Leanne was on her way to Sydney for New Year's, spending it with friends. So it would be a week before the family would realise something was amiss and contact the police. The police, ever the arbiters of urgency, well, to be fair in this case, they weren't exactly given a head start, but they did very, very little anyway. And when I say very little, I mean they simply told Beth Goodall she'll come back. Months before Leanne vanished, Annie Tomanak and Joy Hodgins, who we covered in part 1, disappeared en route to the Ambassador nightclub in Newcastle, where Leanne Goodall worked as a part-time waitress. Then, as we know, months after Leanne vanished, Amanda Robinson and Robyn Hickie would also go missing in Belmont, where Leanne's mother lived, and presumably the location that she was heading after she left the Star Hotel. Police expressed a real reluctance to lump Leanne Goodall's disappearance in with Robyn Hickie and Amanda Robinson's, citing jurisdictional complexities. Now, I can't even begin to fathom what they mean by that. I might just not be the level of intelligence required to comprehend such bullshit. But I know what it is. It's a farce. So much so that even the original detective on the case would later acknowledge that and suggest that Leanne's case should have attracted much more scrutiny than it got, but should have and did galaxies apart in this constellation of incompetence. And in 2001, State Coroner John Abernathy declared Leanne, Amanda and Robyn legally dead, criticising the police work in a scathing review that revealed all of these investigations had been closed within 1 year of their respective disappearances. Let that sink in. In the same inquiry, Abernathy also noted how 2 Sydney-based detectives who were dispatched to help with the disappearance of Amanda Robinson, presumably because Sydney-based detectives have more experience than their Newcastle counterparts. I'm not sure. Well, I would say that Sydney-based detectives definitely had more skill than their Newcastle counterparts. But nevertheless, they were dismissed 2 weeks in. By way of suspects, Abernathy suggested Ivan Milat could be responsible for these 3 girls' disappearances. Milat, however, angrily objected, denying that he had murdered Leanne, Amanda and Robyn. So I guess we'll just have to take his word for it. But even though Abernathy declared Leanne Goodall likely murdered, her name was conspicuously absent from any reinvestigations, including that of Strike Force Arapaima's. Uniting in their frustration, the Robinson, Hickie and Goodall family screamed into the void for parody, insisting that every single lead should go explored, with Leanne's sister Pam pleading to the police, please open her case, please. But they didn't. It's October 12th, 1979. And a gentle breeze drifts over the 16-year-old Amanda Zolis. Affectionate, warm, Amanda is known to perk up at the thought of meeting with her friends, especially at the Christian coffee shop, which is exactly where she plans on spending the evening. At around 7 p.m, she waves goodbye and a neighbour walks with her to the bus stop, chatting about Amanda's plans for the night. But beneath the surface of this ordinary scene, Amanda's life has become anything but ordinary. In the weeks leading up to this evening, Amanda has been living with a growing sense of fear. Death threats have been hanging over her head, serious ones. You'll end up in a pine box. These threats stem from Amanda's alleged decision to become a police informant on the Newcastle drug trade. She's given names and somehow dealers have found out. Her father too has also provided information, putting them both in a precarious position. But the police just say, "You're not in America." Amanda never arrives at the coffee shop, and friends notice her absence, wondering, did she change her plans in the last minute? And they have no idea that behind the scenes, Amanda's father, John, is pacing anxiously, because he doesn't know where she is either. And at 10:15, the phone finally rings, and John picks it up, and thank God, hears Amanda's voice. "I'm going to Queensland," Amanda tells her father, her tone clearly upset and frightened. John presses, "Who are you going with?" Amanda starts crying. She says she needs her clothes, so John tries again. "Who are you going with?" The line goes dead. Amanda never calls back. The police's indifference in Amanda's case is, of course, naturally totally scandalous and mental. And while it might be routine to assume that a teenager has left voluntarily, Amanda Zolis' parents insisted to the police that this was not the case. Informing police of these last days that were punctuated by death threats from drug dealers, they demanded inquiry, demanded that police go and speak to the neighbour that walked with Amanda to the bus stop. They demand police go and speak to her friends at the Christian coffee shop. But the police don't seem to really do any of that, saying she'll come home. Almost 2 decades after Amanda Zolis' disappearance, a woman came forward claiming that she had seen Amanda in a supermarket, leading to police to jump and start planting age-progressed photos all around the town. Of course, nothing came of that. However, the police line 20 years on remained unchanged, that she was still a runaway and that this girl chose to leave. Amanda's mother rightfully rejected these stupid, idiotic, overused, cliche, default, template, non-answers brought forward continuously by the police, and instead asked questions demanding the police answer why. Why, in a case riddled with such drug rumours, was the notion rejected that this was more than a teenage rebellion? Or why did it take them 20 years to finally interview the neighbour who walked Amanda to the bus stop that night? And why? Why did the police so freely and readily accept this runaway theory with such a dismissive laziness that it genuinely makes you wonder? If Amanda was a police informant, was she betrayed by someone, a corrupt person in authority that had a vested interest in the Newcastle drug trade? But that's just speculation and probably carries about as much weight as the runaway theory. But she is gone, and at 16 never really had an opportunity to leave much of anything behind. Just some tearful whispers with a quivering voice speaking to her late dad on that phone before it cut off, and a 46-year silence ensued, where she joined 5 other young souls drifting beyond memory as their families continue to call out their daughters' names into the dark, having forever followed their fading footsteps. In some corner of their mind, hoping and imagining that their precious girl has found refuge. But in that long, long silence that's followed, only the echoes of their love really remain, longing for a response that'll probably never come.
Sis, if you're watching, we're not giving up hope, we're keeping strong, and you keep strong. And we're not giving up on you till we find you. And we love you very much.